The clang of the hammer on iron was the heartbeat of Dry Creek, a rhythm as steady as the sun's rise over the far hills. It rang through the hot air, clear and sharp, cutting past the whispers of desert wind and the creak of weathered wood on the buildings lining the single dusty street. Folks had grown used to that sound, found comfort in it the way a man might in a steady lantern glow on a long night. But the day the forge door swung open and shadows spilled across the glowing coals, the rhythm faltered. They thought they saw a tired old blacksmith, broad-shouldered but bent with years, his face marked by time and work. They didn't see the years he'd spent staring down the barrels of other men's guns. They didn't see the graves he'd left in the dust. They didn't know the forge was still hot with a fire they couldn't hope to survive. Dry Creek in the late summer sun looked more like a painting left too long in the light, faded colors, edges curling with age. The boards on the general store's porch groaned under every boot, and the swinging saloon doors opened onto shadows that smelled of whiskey and smoke. Out beyond the edge of town, the desert spread endless and pale, shimmering under the weight of heat. Dust clung to everything, wagon wheels, hitching posts, even the church's steeple cross seemed painted in grit. The wind carried it in slow, lazy swirls, as if the whole place was caught in a constant, patient drift toward being swallowed by the land itself. Elias Crowe stood at his anvil in the heart of it all, the steady pulse of the forge drawing eyes even from across the street. His hair was silver at the temples, the rest as dark and coarse as the coal dust clinging to his shirt. His arms, corded with muscle, worked with the precision of a man who knew the weight and heat of metal like other men knew their own pulse. He was a fixture of Dry Creek, the sort of man you nodded to but didn't bother too much, respectful, distant, steady as stone. Most folks never asked what road he'd walked before setting up his smithy. They saw only the hammer, the apron, the glowing iron, and that's exactly how he liked it. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, when the past seemed to seep through the cracks, when his eyes followed the movement of a stranger's hand toward his belt just a fraction too fast, or when his body shifted toward cover without him thinking. A habit, a shadow of someone he used to be, long before the heat of the forge became his shield. Sometimes, alone at night, he'd catch himself staring at the corner of the shop, where the floorboards sat looser than the rest, and his jaw would tighten. That was where he'd buried the old life. The day the Graysons came, the sky was a hard, blinding blue, and the air shimmered above the rooftops. 5 riders appeared at the far end of Main Street, the metallic jingle of spurs and the hollow thump of hooves cutting through the hum of town life. Cole Grayson rode at their center, straight-backed and broad, his hat tipped low enough to shade the sharp glint in his eyes. His men fanned out behind him, dust-coated coats, revolvers loose in their holsters, grins that carried no warmth. Folks stopped what they were doing to watch, but no one stepped into their path. Elias kept working as the hoofbeats drew closer. He lifted the glowing length of iron from the coals, sparks leaping into the dim corners of the shop as he turned it over with practiced ease. The hiss of metal meeting water filled the air as the riders dismounted just outside. Boots crunched on gravel. Afternoon. Cole's voice carried easily through the open doorway, casual as a man greeting a friend he didn't much care for. You the one they call Crowe. Elias set the iron back on the anvil and met the man's gaze without blinking. Name's Elias. I'm the blacksmith here. Cole stepped inside, his shadow falling across the forge. He licked at his boots. Blacksmith, sure, but I hear tell you're more than that. He let the words hang, glancing around the shop like he might spot proof of the rumor in the tools and scraps of metal. His men spread out, leaning against walls, brushing dust from their coats, hands never far from their belts. Don't know what you've heard, Elias said, voice steady. But I shoe horses, fix plows, and hammer steel. That's all. Cole smiled faintly, but his eyes stayed hard. Shame. See, me and my boys, we're setting up in Dry Creek for a spell. Gonna make this place friendlier for folks like us. That means every business in town's gonna be under our care. And that care costs. Elias picked up the hammer again, turning the weight of it in his hand. You want something made. You pay the rate on the board, same as everyone else. Cole's smile disappeared. That ain't how this works. The air in the shop seemed to thicken. One of the gang shifted, boots scraping against the floorboards. Elias' eyes flicked toward him, just for a second, then back to Cole. The hammer in his grip was still warm from the last strike, and the faint glow of the iron on the anvil painted the edge of his jaw in orange light. "You boys look like you've been riding hard," Elias said evenly. "Might be wise to cool your heads before you make trouble you can't walk away from." Cole stepped closer, the space between them closing to just a few feet. The smell of dust and leather mixed with the tang of hot metal. "You think you can talk to me like that because you're standing behind a forge? You think that hammer's going to keep you safe?" Elias didn't move. "I think you ought to leave before you find out." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of sagebrush through the open doorway. The other men watched restless, eyes darting between their leader and the blacksmith. Finally, Cole's mouth curved into a slow, dangerous grin. "We'll be seeing you, Crowe." He turned, boots grinding against the dirt floor, and strode out into the sunlight. His men followed, but not before one of them spat on the edge of the anvil, the hiss of it against the hot metal sharp in the silence. Elias watched them go, his gaze steady, jaw tight. When the last shadow passed out of the doorway, he set the hammer down and picked up the iron once more. The forge's glow lit the hard lines of his face as he turned the metal over, the heat dancing in his eyes. Out in the street, Cole swung into his saddle without looking back. The riders moved down Main, slow and easy, like they owned the place already. But inside the forge, the air was still alive with heat, and the man at the anvil worked on, each strike ringing out sharp and sure. By the time the sound of hooves faded into the desert, Elias' hands were steady again. The hammer rose and fell, each clang echoing through the town, like a warning no one quite understood. Not yet, because the truth was, the fire in the forge wasn't just for bending steel. And before long, everyone in Dry Creek, including the Grayson gang, would find out just how hot that fire could burn. That night, after the Graysons had ridden out of sight, and the last ember in the forge had faded to a dull red, Elias sat alone in the half-light of his shop. The desert wind whispered through the gaps in the shutters, carrying the faint rattle of a loose sign down the street. His hands rested on his knees, fingers still stained black with soot, but his mind was far from the present. It drifted unbidden into the years he tried to bury. He had been younger then, leaner, quicker, his hair dark as the midnight trail. Folks didn't call him Elias Crowe in those days. They called him Crowe's Fire, and the name carried the weight of fear from Arizona to New Mexico and all the way into the edge of Texas. It wasn't just his speed. Plenty of men could draw fast. It was the way he moved in a fight, calm, precise, unflinching, like the gun was an extension of his will. More than one saloon went quiet when his boots hit the floorboards. He'd made his living with the revolver, taking jobs that kept him in coin and kept other men in the ground. But every reputation earns its shadow. His came one hot afternoon in Abilene, when a job to settle a dispute between ranchers turned into something else entirely. The man he'd been paid to face had a daughter, a slip of a girl who darted into the street just as the gunsmoke curled. He still didn't know whose bullet it was, but it didn't matter. She'd fallen before his eyes, and when the sound of the shots died, all that remained was her small, still form in the dust. He'd watched her father drop his weapon to gather her up, and in that instant, Elias had felt the weight of every life he'd taken pressed down like a mountain. That night, he swore an oath to himself, no more. No more gun for hire, no more fights for pay, no more blood spilled at the squeeze of his trigger. He left the territories where his name was still spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. By the time he reached Dry Creek, he was just another man looking for work, carrying more past than possessions. The forge became his salvation. It gave him something to build instead of destroy, a heat that tempered steel instead of shattering lives. He traded the rhythm of the draw for the rhythm of the hammer, the hiss of water over hot iron replacing the roar of gunfire. Years passed. His hands grew rough from the anvil, his back strong from the work. Little by little, the edges of Crowe's fire dulled in the minds of others, until only Elias remained. But in the days after the Graysons arrived, old instinct stirred. He saw it in the way townsfolk stepped aside when the gang walked by, in the way voices dropped to whispers in the saloon. The Graysons didn't waste time making their presence felt. Two of them swaggered into the mercantile, sweeping tins from shelves until the shopkeeper's wife agreed to pay for protection. Another pair cornered the stable owner, demanding horses and feed without a coin changing hands. From his shop doorway, Elias watched Sheriff Dugan pass the gang on the street, tipping his hat like a man greeting neighbors instead of outlaws. The sheriff's badge caught the sunlight, but there was no strength in the way he carried it. Elias recognized the look. A man who decided long before the fight started that he'd already lost. The plan behind the Grayson swagger became clear soon enough. Dry Creek sat on a trade route less traveled than the main cattle trails, but close enough to the border to be useful. With its small law force and wide-open land, it was the perfect place to move stolen goods, smuggled liquor, and whatever else Cole Grayson had in mind. The town wasn't just a stopover, it was a staging ground. Elias kept his head down, hammering steel, fixing wagon axles, reshaping horseshoes. But each night, when the doors were shut and the coals burned low, he'd hear echoes of boots on saloon floors, sharp voices demanding coin, and he'd feel that slow burn in his chest. On a late afternoon, with the sun low and the air thick with heat, a knock sounded at the forge door. It was Sammy, the boy from the boarding house, barely 12, but already doing odd jobs for coin. He was carrying a burlap sack of coal almost as big as he was, his face streaked with dust and sweat. "Mrs. Atwell said you needed more," the boy panted, setting the sack down with a grunt. Elias nodded, handing him a tin cup of water. Sammy drank in quick gulps, then wandered toward the forge, curiosity plain in his eyes. "You ever get tired of all the heat?" he asked. Elias allowed himself the faintest smile. "Heat's what shapes the steel. Without it, iron's just rock." As Elias turned back to his work, he heard the faint scuff of boots on wood. Sammy had wandered toward the far corner, where the floorboards near the anvil were just a shade lighter than the rest. The boy crouched, peering at the edge where one plank didn't quite sit flush. "What's under here?" he asked, running a finger along the seam. Elias was at his side in an instant, his shadow falling over the boy. "Coal dust," he said evenly, though his voice held a weight Sammy didn't understand. "Nothing worth looking at." Sammy looked up, wide-eyed, sensing something he couldn't name. "Didn't mean nothing by it." "I know," Elias said, softer now. He straightened, resting a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder before nodding toward the door. "Best get on home before Mrs. Atwell comes looking for you." The boy left with a wave, disappearing into the lengthening shadows of the street. Elias stood alone again, staring at that corner of the floor. Beneath those boards, wrapped in oiled cloth that had held back years of rust, lay the cold peacemaker that had once made him Crow's fire. The weight of it was still in his memory, the balance, the recoil, the smell of powder. He'd sworn it would never see daylight again. But as the wind pushed dust under the forge door and carried with it the faint echo of laughter from down the street, the rough, mocking kind that belonged to men like the Graysons, he felt the old fire stir just a little hotter. The kind of heat that didn't come from coal or flame, but from the part of a man that refuses to see the innocent trampled. And though the gun stayed hidden that night, Elias knew the day was coming when the choice to keep it buried would no longer be his to make. By the end of the week, the Graysons had shed the thin veil of civility they'd worn when they first rode in. They swaggered through town like wolves that had tasted blood, their spurs clicking out a rhythm that made shopkeepers tense and mothers pull their children closer. Windows were smashed without warning. The front steps of the mercantile lay in splinters after one of the brothers rode a horse straight onto the porch to make a point. An old man selling apples had his cart overturned, fruit rolling into the dust, while the gang laughed. Women hurried down boardwalks with their eyes low, skirts gathered in clenched fists, while children were yanked indoors at the sight of the gang's shadows stretching long in the late sun. Cole Grayson didn't need to raise his voice. His smirk was enough to make most men step aside. Elias stayed at his forge, the heat of the fire washing over him as he hammered and shaped, letting the sound drown out the shouts and crashes echoing from the street. The ring of steel on steel was his refuge. Every blow of the hammer was a promise to himself. This is the life now. This is the line I hold. But outside, the line was shifting with every boot the Graysons put to the town's throat. Clara Whitfield came to him one evening as the sun was slipping behind the mesa, turning the air gold. She stepped into the shop in her simple blue dress, dust clinging to the hem, the smell of chalk faint on her hands. Her face carried the calm of someone who'd had to be strong for too long. "They're getting bolder," she said without preamble. Her voice was low but steady, the same tone she used to settle a room of restless pupils. Elias set down the tongs he'd been holding. "I've seen. They came to the schoolhouse today." Her eyes held his, not flinching. "Not for the children. They know better than to harm them, at least for now. But they broke the door latch. Said the town needs to remember who's in charge." Elias felt something stir in his chest, a hot twist of anger he kept banked like the coals at midnight. "You all right?" "I am. The children were frightened, but I kept them calm. Still, they're making it clear they can reach anywhere. Anyone." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the forge, stoking the fire until it flared bright. The truth was, he could feel her words pressing on the weakest part of his resolve. "You could stop them," she said softly. His jaw tightened. "That's not who I am anymore." "It's exactly who you are," she countered, taking a step closer. "Maybe you buried it deep, but it's still there. I've seen the way you watch them, the way you move when they're near. You've faced men like this before. And if you don't stand up now, Elias, they'll keep taking until there's nothing left of this town to save." He looked at her then, really looked, seeing not just the teacher but the widow who'd kept the schoolhouse running when her husband died in a mine collapse, who'd held the town's children together with little more than patience and will. There was no fear in her eyes, only urgency. The weight of his vow pressed down harder than the desert heat. He'd promised himself never to kill again, never to let the gun decide the shape of his life. But another part of him, the part forged in dust and danger, knew that sometimes the choice wasn't yours. Sometimes it was made for you. The next day, the Graysons made their boldest move yet. They returned to the schoolhouse while class was in session. Cole himself pushed through the door, leaning against the frame as if he owned the place. His men stood outside, blocking the sunlight. "Pretty little setup you've got here," he drawled, eyes flicking over the rows of children. "Be a shame if something happened to it." Clara stood her ground at the front of the room, a piece of chalk still in her hand. "This is a place for learning, Mr. Grayson, not your business." Cole grinned. "Everything in this town's my business." His gaze lingered on her a moment too long before he turned and left, his boots loud against the porch boards. Word of it spread fast. By the time the sun dipped low, Elias had heard the story 3 times from 3 different mouths. That evening, as the last of the light faded, he lifted a glowing length of iron from the forge. The metal burned white-hot, throwing his face into harsh relief. He carried it to the quench barrel and plunged it in. Steam roared upward, a hiss like some coiled thing inside him finally exhaling. The vapor curled around his shoulders and drifted toward the rafters, vanishing into the dark. The shop door creaked open. Cole Grayson stepped inside, alone this time, the light from the forge painting him in flickers of orange and shadow. He stopped a few paces from Elias, his boots planted wide. "You got a nice little operation here," Cole said, looking around as if taking stock. "Be a shame if that fire went out." Elias set the iron aside and straightened, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the anvil. "You're wasting your time." Cole's smile was slow, deliberate. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm giving you fair warning. Stay out of it, old man, or the fire dies with you." The words hung between them, heavy and hot as the forge. Cole lingered a beat longer, then turned and walked out into the night, leaving the door open behind him. Elias stood there long after the sound of boots faded, the forge light dancing against the walls. The hiss of the quenched iron still seemed to echo in his ears, a sound that was less about cooling metal and more about the quiet, rising fury of a man who knew the heat couldn't be contained forever. The news reached Elias before the dust had settled. Sammy burst into the forge, his small chest heaving, eyes wild with fear. They heard Pa. The words tumbled out in a rush, and Elias didn't wait for more. He grabbed his coat, crossed the street in long, urgent strides, and found the store's front window shattered, shelves tipped, a trail of spilled flour, streaked with red, where someone had been dragged. Inside, Sammy's father lay on the floor, propped against a barrel, his face pale and slick with sweat. A rag was pressed to his side, blooming with blood. Clara knelt beside him, her hands steady but her voice taut as she tried to keep him conscious. They came in shouting, she said without looking up. Cole wanted money. When Jacob said he didn't have it, one of them knocked him down and... Her mouth tightened, and she swallowed the rest. Elias dropped to his knees, pressing his hands over hers to keep the cloth firm against the wound. His touch was precise, practiced, not from fear, but from the iron control it took to keep from rising, finding the Graysons, and ending it here and now. His fingers trembled with the effort. Jacob groaned. Don't let him take the store, he murmured, eyes fluttering. They won't, Elias said, his voice like cooled steel. Not while I'm here. The sheriff arrived minutes later, hat in hand, sweat rolling down his neck. He took one look at Jacob, then shifted uncomfortably. Elias, I can't stop them. You know that. They've got more men than I do, more firepower. If I go after him now, they'll just come back harder. Elias' jaw tightened. So you'll do nothing? The sheriff looked away. I'll keep the peace best I can. You're not keeping the peace, Elias said quietly. You're letting them own it. That night, the forge felt colder than it had in years. Elias sat on the stool near the anvil, the fire banked low, shadows crawling over the walls. His gaze drifted again to the corner, where the floorboards ran a fraction short. The air seemed heavier there, as if the past itself was pressing upward through the wood. Slowly, he knelt and pulled the boards aside. The oilcloth was just as he'd left it. He unwrapped it partway, the revolver steel catching the dim light. His fingers traced the barrel like an old friend's face, but he didn't lift it out. Not yet. Instead, another memory rose, sharp, fast, uninvited. A dusty street at high noon, the world holding its breath. The man across from him had been faster than most, his hand twitching near the grip, eyes hard with certainty. Elias remembered the feel of the wind against his cheek, the weight of the Colt in his palm, the way time seemed to stretch just before the draw. Then the blur, hand to gun, hammer back, muzzle flash, and the other man's face changing in that instant he realized he'd been beaten. Elias had lived by that speed, and others had died by it. He set the gun aside and began gathering scrap from around the forge, old wagon parts, broken plow teeth, anything with bite. He heated and shaped them, forging cruel little stars meant to shred a horse's hoof, links of iron to reinforce the shop door, hinges for hidden latches. The clangs were sharper tonight, more deliberate, each strike carrying the weight of a decision he hadn't fully voiced even to himself. Near midnight, a knock came. Clara stepped inside, the light from the forge outlining her like a figure in a painting. She glanced at the caltrops cooling on the bench, the iron bars on the table, and then at him. You're getting ready, she said softly. He didn't look up. I'm making sure they can't walk in here like they own it. That's not all you're doing. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as if searching his face for something. I've heard the stories. Not in detail, just whispers from years ago, from towns where they said a man called Crow's fire could outdraw the devil himself. I didn't believe them. Not until now. Elias paused, the hammer still in his hand. That man's gone. Her voice was gentle, but unyielding. He's not gone. You've just kept him locked away. But he's still here, and maybe this town needs him. He met her gaze then, and for a long moment they stood in the hum of the forge, the air between them thick with truth neither had wanted to name. If I do this, he said finally, there's no going back. You think there's anything left to go back to? She asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. Clara's eyes softened, but she didn't say more. She turned and left, the door closing behind her with a quiet finality. Elias stood there for a long time after she was gone, staring at the half-finished work on the bench. Then he reached for the oilcloth. This time, he unwrapped the gun completely, the metal cool and solid in his grip. He spun the cylinder, the smooth click echoing in the stillness, and began loading each chamber with steady hands. When he was done, he laid the revolver on the anvil. The fire in the forge flared as he stoked it, casting his shadow tall against the wall. In his eyes, the same light burned, steady, unblinking, ready. The air smelled of hot steel and something older, something dangerous. The blacksmith's fire was no longer just for shaping iron. It was the fire of a man ready to shape the fate of everyone who had mistaken his silence for surrender. Dawn bled slowly across Dry Creek, painting the horizon in bruised gold and dusty rose. The air was cool for the moment, but the promise of heat shimmered in the stillness. Elias stood in the middle of Main Street, boots planted, apron still tied over his work shirt. The hammer hung loose in his right hand, the revolver resting at his hip in a worn holster that hadn't seen daylight in years. From the far end of the street came the low thunder of hooves. The Graysons rode in 5 abreast, the sun at their backs casting them in silhouette. Cole was at the center, tall in the saddle, had Brim cutting a sharp shadow across his eyes. His men flanked him, the glint of revolvers at their sides, the occasional metallic jingle of spurs breaking the silence. Elias didn't move. Dust drifted around his boots, curling in lazy swirls. He could hear the leather creak under their weight, the faint jangle of bridles, the rhythmic thud of iron shoes on packed earth. Every detail sharpened in the waiting. The riders slowed as they reached the blacksmith. Cole's gaze swept the street, noting the shuttered windows, the faint faces peering from behind curtains. Then his eyes locked on Elias. "You're making a mistake, Crowe," he called, voice carrying easily in the morning air. "Looks to me like you're the one riding into it." Elias replied, his tone flat. One of Cole's men chuckled and nudged his horse forward. His hand twitched toward the revolver at his hip. Elias shifted the hammer in his grip, stepped forward, and swung. The head of the hammer caught the man's wrist with a bone-crunching crack, sending the pistol clattering to the dirt. The horse reared, and the thug tumbled from the saddle, cursing and clutching his arm. That was enough to set the others moving. The street erupted in the harsh roar of gunfire. Elias dropped behind a water trough as bullets punched splinters from the boards beside him. He came up firing, his Colt steady in his hand, each shot precise and deliberate. The first man to fall dropped before he could clear his holster. From the forge, the traps he'd set came into play. A caltrop scattered under a galloping horse sent the beast shrieking and bucking, throwing its rider into the dust. Another man darted for the blacksmith shop only to slam against the reinforced door Elias had braced with solid iron. Sparks flew as a bullet ricocheted off a steel plate propped in the window, the sharp ping echoing in the chaos. Elias moved like a man 20 years younger, the rhythm of the fight flowing back into his muscles as if it had never left. He fired, shifted, ducked, swung the hammer, the heat of the rising sun mingling with the burn of the forge fire still in his blood. The townsfolk, seeing him stand, began to emerge. The stable owner appeared with a pitchfork, driving back one of the gang. The storekeeper's son fired a shotgun from the doorway, sending 2 Grayson riders scrambling for cover. Every movement tipped the balance. Cole, realizing the fight was slipping, swung down from his horse. Dust curled around his boots as he stepped into the open, eyes locked on Elias. "You've got some fight left after all," he said, almost smiling. "Enough for you," Elias answered. The world narrowed to the space between them. The heat seemed to press down, the sounds of the fight fading until only the rasp of breath and the slow flex of fingers near holsters remained. Cole's hand twitched first. Elias didn't think, he moved. The Colt came up, the hammer fell, and the shot cracked like the splitting of the earth. Cole staggered, a look of disbelief flickering across his face before he dropped to his knees, then to the dust. His revolver lay inches from his hand, untouched. The remaining Graysons broke. They mounted fast, spurring their horses into a retreat that left only churned earth and a trail of dust behind. The street fell quiet except for the distant thunder of their flight and the labored breathing of those who remained. Elias stood over Cole's still form for a long moment, then holstered the Colt. Around him, The townsfolk began to gather, their eyes wide, their voices hushed. Somewhere down the street, the first hopeful cheer rose. But Elias only turned, the hammer still in his hand, and walked back toward the forge. The sun had climbed higher now, and the heat shimmered across the street like a veil. Inside the shop, the coals still glowed, ready to shape whatever came next. The sun was high by the time the last echo of hoofbeats faded over the ridge. Main Street lay quiet except for the scrape of boots on dirt and the low murmur of voices. The townsfolk moved slowly, gathering themselves after the storm. A few men carried the bodies away, 3 of the Graysons' riders and Cole himself, their weight heavy not just in the arms that bore them, but in the hearts of those who watched. There was relief in the air, yes, but something else, too. The sober awe of seeing what Elias Crowe could do with a gun in his hand. People clapped him on the back as he passed, their voices rising in thanks. But their eyes followed him differently now, respect edged with a trace of wariness. The blacksmith they had known for years had revealed something fierce, something older than the town itself. Elias offered no speeches, no reassurances. He simply nodded and walked on, leaving their gratitude behind like dust in the wind. He reached the forge without hurry, pushing open the door to find the air still warm from the morning's work. The familiar scent of coal and iron wrapped around him. Without removing his apron, he crossed to the corner where the floorboards ran uneven. Kneeling, he pried them up, the old wood creaking in protest. The revolver lay there on its bed of oilcloth, still smelling faintly of smoke. For a long moment he held it in his palm, the steel cool again, its weight both comforting and condemning. This gun had saved him more times than he could count, and cost him just as much. Slowly, deliberately, he wrapped it once more and lowered it back into its hiding place. The boards went down over it with a dull thump, sealing it away, not forever, perhaps, but for as long as peace would allow. A shadow fell across the doorway. Sheriff Dugan stepped inside, his hat in his hands, the badge on his chest catching the forge light. "Crowe," he said, voice thick with something between gratitude and shame. "You saved this town. If you want it, I'll make it official. Deputy badge, authority to keep things in line." Elias didn't even glance at the badge. "Not my calling," he said. "You'd be good at it." "I've been good at it," Elias replied, his tone flat but not unkind. "That's why I laid it down. Law or no law, a gun's still a gun, and I've seen enough of what it does." The sheriff studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." He left as quietly as he'd come, boots fading into the street noise outside. Elias turned back to the forge, stoking the coals, when the door opened again. Clara stepped in, the light catching the gold in her hair. She didn't speak right away, just looked at him as if trying to reconcile the man who'd stood in the street at dawn with the one standing here now. Sleeves rolled, hands blackened with soot. "You kept your promise," she said finally. He met her gaze. "Which one?" "The one you made to this town today, whether you meant to or not." Her lips curved in the faintest smile, though her eyes were steady. "I'm glad you were here, Elias." For a moment, the air between them held something unspoken, respect, perhaps more than that, but neither moved to break it. She gave a small nod and stepped back out into the daylight. He thought he was alone again until he noticed a figure at the doorway. Sammy stood there, capping his hands, eyes wide. "Pa says you're the reason we still got the store," he said, voice small but proud. "You were faster than they said you'd be. Faster than in the stories." Elias leaned on the anvil, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Don't put too much stock in stories, boy. They always leave out the parts worth remembering." Sammy nodded, though he didn't seem to believe it. The way he looked at Elias had changed, too. Not just admiration, but the kind of trust a boy gives the man he knows will stand between him and the dark. When the street finally emptied and the heat of the day settled in, Elias fed the fire until the coals glowed bright again. He lifted a bar of iron to the anvil and raised the hammer high. The strike rang out, sharp and sure, sparks leaping into the dim corners. The heat in the forge never truly dies. In Dry Creek, folks would speak of the day the blacksmith's fire burned the darkness away, and the tale would grow with each telling. But here, now, it was just Elias, the anvil, and the glow of the coals, each strike of his hammer, sounding like the echo of a gunshot, fading into the long, quiet day.